Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to Adventures in History. Today's topic is Andrew Jackson, Part 3, 7th U.S. President. We stopped last time in 1831. Andrew Jackson had been elected for his first term in 1828, inaugurated in 1829, so he was about halfway through his first term. And the so-called Peggy O'Neill affair developed, which was a very strange political controversy. Peggy O'Neill, in April of 1831, married the Secretary of War, John Eaton. So her husband was in the cabinet. Peggy was considered a bad woman by the high society women in Washington, the powerful women in Washington. Her first husband had committed suicide, and Peggy had been seen with John Eaton while still married to John Timberlake. The cabinet wives refused to attend parties that Peggy attended. So they believed that Peggy was not conforming to the standards of female behavior of that time, that she had not been loyal to her first husband and was a so-called loose woman. Now, Jackson defended Peggy. He saw in the things that were being said about her and the treatment of her, he saw a mirror of how his wife had been treated. And according to historical sources, Peggy O'Neill probably was not really was a so-called loose woman, or at least flirtatious. At any rate, Andrew Jackson, his whole life believed in doing the right thing. And so he decided to defend Peggy, and it became a big political controversy. Took a lot of time. Martin Van Buren, who was a very smart politician, saw that Jackson was very much in favor of Peggy, so he also became in favor of her as well for political reasons. Now, the tragedy of all this is that Jackson's adopted son, Andrew Donaldson, and who was serving as his assistant, and Andrew's wife, Emily, who was the first serving as First Lady, they became estranged because Emily, of course, was connected to these other powerful women in Washington who were all rejecting Peggy. And so she rejected her as well. And this led to conflict. Very, very unfortunate. And so Jackson pressured Emily to stay in Tennessee regarding the Peggy Eaton affair, and bring the children to Tennessee. And Andrew Donaldson stayed at the White House, serving as Jackson's personal assistant, but they were estranged. They just had a business relationship. So this was very, very unfortunate for Jackson because he really loved Emily, and then his grandchildren were taken away, Emily and. Anyway, by the following year, they worked things out, and Andrew, Emily, and their children returned. All were in the White House, and Peggy Eaton, John and Peggy Eaton, left Washington for Tennessee, and John Eaton resigned from the cabinet. 1832, Andrew Jackson Jr. married Sarah York, Jackson's other adopted son. The same year, Jackson had a bullet in his left arm removed. One of these bullets that were in his body. The doctor cut his arm and the bullet popped out, falling on the floor. 1831, Jackson wanted to go home. He said, quote, "Could I with honor, I would fly to the Hermitage, there to bury myself from the corruption and treachery of this wicked world, where the wicked never cease troubling, and there the weary can have no rest. But this to me is denied, and I must submit." So he decided to run for re-election in 1832. Also in 1831, an American ship was attacked in Sumatra, now Indonesia. It was involved in the pepper trade. They had the so-called Spice Islands, which were in Indonesia, and back then. 3 Americans were killed in this conflict, so the U.S. Navy was sent. There was the Battle of Kuala Batu, where 100 Sumatrans were killed and 2 Americans died. 1832, Congress made effort, or decided they wanted to move George Washington's remains from Mount Vernon to a tomb in the Capitol. However, there was great resistance resistance in Virginia, and Virginia threatened to secede if Washington's remains were removed. So Congress backed down, and they're still there at his home at Mount Vernon. The famous author Washington Irving said about Andrew Jackson, quote, "As his admirers say, he is truly an old Roman, to which I would add with a little dash of Greek, for I suspect he is as knowing as I believe he is honest." So 1832, the campaign, a re-election campaign, they had Hickory Clubs. Since his nickname was Old Hickory, the Hickory Clubs were devoted to his re-election. And during the campaign, there were barbecues, parades, songs, and cheers. There was a mile-long Andrew Jackson parade in New York City for his re-election with torches and banners. The theme song went like this, quote, "Hurrah for the hickory tree! Hurrah for the hickory tree! Its branches will wave o'er tyranny's grave." Now, one of the things that Jackson got involved in was he wanted to abolish the Bank of the United States, which he believed was corrupt. And Martin Van Buren was a big supporter. Nicholas Biddle was the head of the Bank of the U.S., and so this was a major conflict between Andrew Jackson and Nicholas Biddle. Nicholas Biddle was very powerful. He was strong-willed, had a sense of personal destiny, wealthy, arrogant, ruthless, and brilliant. And he was a master of the secret science of money. So Andrew Jackson's war on the U.S. Bank, this is a debatable topic back then and up till now. But he believed, again, Jackson believed in doing the right thing, and he believed this bank was corrupt, and he thought it should be abolished. So he worked for that. Jackson in 1832 said about the Bank of the U.S., quote, "When the laws undertake to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful, the humble members of society, the farmers, mechanics, and laborers, who have neither the time nor the means for securing like favors to themselves, have a right to complain of the injustice of their government." I think we have the same problem today with the banks today and the Federal Reserve rather. So it's all debatable, all controversial. And anyway, Jackson decided that he was going to destroy the U.S. Bank, and he said in 1832. Of course, Biddle fought back. There was major conflict. And Andrew Jackson said in 1832, quote, "The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." Jackson further said, quote, "There are no necessary evils in government. Its evils exist only in its abuses. If it would confine itself to equal protection and as heaven does its rains, showers its favors alike on the high and the low, the rich and the poor, it would be an unqualified blessing." Again, Jackson hated this bank. It was the second bank of the U.S. that had public money but was privately managed and that he believed was corrupt. So this was an ongoing war that he had. He vetoed the bank renewal and fought Henry Clay, his political opponent, who was the major political supporter of the bank, and Nicholas Biddle. Andrew Jackson said regarding the U.S. Bank, quote, "Is there no danger to our liberty and independence in a bank that in its nature has so little to bind it to our country? Is there not cause to tremble for the purity of our elections in peace, and for the independence of our country in war, controlling our currency, receiving our public monies, and holding thousands of our citizens' independence? It would be more formidable and dangerous than a naval and military power of the enemy." Now, Nicholas Biddle wanted to renew the bank charter in 1832 with the support of Henry Clay. In July of that year, Congress renewed the charter, but President Jackson vetoed that bill, and he gave 4 reasons: that this bank was a government-granted bank monopoly that benefited the few rich and foreigners. So this ongoing war against Andrew Jackson and against Nicholas Biddle and the U.S. Bank. Daniel Webster was a supporter of the bank. However, he was controlled by Biddle and received loans from the bank. He gave pro-bank speeches. To destroy the U.S. Bank, President Jackson wanted to transfer federal money to state banks, and he gave this order to Treasury Secretary William Duane, who refused. So Jackson fired Duane and appointed Roger Taney as the new Treasury Secretary. In October, there was the removal of the bank money was on schedule. Nicholas Biddle fought back. He called in loans and restricted credit, trying to create an anti-Jackson sentiment. Biddle decided to do what he could to hurt the economy in hopes that the public would blame Jackson. So it was a war, Andrew Jackson against Nicholas Biddle, a war for public opinion. And Biddle was using bank money to bribe congressmen for the recharter. 1833, distressed businessmen pled with President Jackson for relief during the economic hard times that had come. And Jackson said, quote, "Insolvent, do you say? What do you come to me for then? Go to Nicholas Biddle. We have no money here, gentlemen. Biddle has all the money. He has millions of specie in his vaults at this moment idle. Sooner than restore the deposits or recharter the bank, I would undergo the torture of 10 Spanish Inquisitions. Sooner than live in a country where such a power exists, I would seek asylum in the wilds of Arabia." 1832, Jackson was reelected. This was considered a victory in his war against Nicholas Biddle and the U.S. Bank, but the war was ongoing. Jackson was transferring federal deposits from the U.S. Bank to state banks. And again, Biddle's response was to destroy the economy. War for public opinion. The question was, who was to blame for the hard times, Andrew Jackson or Nicholas Biddle? During this time, Congress censured Jackson, which was a Biddle victory. Now the thing is, Nicholas Biddle was arrogant. He boasted in public of the power that he had to destroy the American economy. Pennsylvania Governor George Wolfe condemned Biddle, and the public turned against Nicholas Biddle, and Congress responded and voted to close the U.S. Bank. So this was a victory. Andrew Jackson was able to win this victory that he fought against the U.S. Bank. Another major issue of Jackson's presidency and life was his relationship with American Indians. Of course, he had fought Indians in Alabama and Florida. And he said this, 1829, quote, "Our conduct toward these people is deeply interesting to our national character. Their present condition, contrasted with what they once were, makes a powerful appeal to our sympathies. Our ancestors found them the uncontrolled possessors of these vast regions. By persuasion and force, they have been made to retire from river to river and from mountain to mountain until some of the tribes have become extinct, and others have left but remnants to preserve for a while their once terrible names. It is too late to inquire whether it was just in the United States to include them and their territory within the bounds of new states. That step cannot be retraced. A state cannot be dismembered by Congress." President Jackson could not support the reality of an independent Indian state within Georgia's borders, which was the Cherokee Nation, which was the size of New Jersey. By 1830, Jackson worked to pass the Indian Removal Act. This was one of the things people condemned him for. The Indians in the east were to be moved to Oklahoma. The Cherokees in Georgia resisted. And then there was, of course, the Trail of Tears, in which many Cherokee Indians died on the trip west. That was not handled well. Jackson believed the Indians would be safer out west. Now, this was very controversial then and still is, because there were still Iroquois Indians in New York State, and the Cherokees in North Carolina were allowed to stay. They got along with the European descent Americans. However, they were much smaller in numbers, and as I said, the Cherokee land in Georgia was the size of New Jersey. Now, there's a few years ago, this was a major political controversy regarding the Cherokee Indians, the Trail of Tears, and the efforts to remove Andrew Jackson's image from the $20 bill. Again, the Cherokee land in Georgia was the size of New Jersey. Indians had moved west since the George Washington presidency. An 1831 letter from Georgia's governor, George Gilmer, to President Jackson asked for help, and Governor Gilmer wrote, quote, "The Indians have neither been compelled to pay taxes nor perform any civic duties. The only operation of the laws since the extension of the jurisdiction of the state over them has been to protect them from injury by the punishment of crimes and the removal of white people who had been tempted into their country by the attraction of the gold mines. If the Cherokee are to continue inhabitants of this state, they must be rendered subject to the ordinary operation of the laws, with less expense and trouble, and more effectually than heretofore." In Jackson's 1829 inaugural address, he said, quote, "It will be my sincere and constant desire to observe toward the Indian tribes within our limits a just and liberal policy, and to give that humane and considerate attention to their rights and their wants, which is consistent with the habits of our government and the feelings of our people." Huge gold deposits had been discovered in Georgia in the 1820s. In 1827, the Cherokees declared themselves an independent country in Georgia, and this became a very controversial issue. How could we have an independent country within the United States? Now the question is, if Andrew Jackson did nothing, the belief was that the authorities in Georgia would take the Cherokee land and evict them, which would be a disaster for the Cherokees, because and they would have no place to go. And now critics said Jackson should protect the Cherokees by sending in the U.S. Army to protect them in Georgia, but this was politically impossible, and there was a belief that this would promote the secession of Georgia. Again, the Cherokees were an independent state in Georgia. They had been used by the British as a tool of aggression. So Jackson believed that removal was the best option. Historian Robert Remini wrote, quote, "Through removal, the Indians would escape certain annihilation and preserve their identity and culture. It was never Indians per se that bothered Andrew Jackson. It was their infernal presence as a tribe, as a unit separate and distinct from the rest of the country." Now again, the removal, especially with the Cherokees, was cruel and corrupt. Robert Remini wrote, quote, "In a single week, some 17,000 Cherokees were rounded up and herded into what was surely a concentration camp. Many sickened and died while they awaited transport to the west." Father Francis Paul Frucha wrote, quote, "In his direct dealings with Indians, Andrew Jackson insisted on justice toward both hostile and peaceful Indians. Those who committed outrages against the whites were to be summarily punished, but the rights of friendly Indians were protected. Georgia Governor William Rabun ordered a militia attack on friendly Indians in the Seminole War, and Andrew Jackson was enraged. Jackson condemned such actions as, quote, "base, cowardly, and an inhuman attack. Such base cowardice and murderous conduct as this transaction affords has not its parallel in history, and should be met with its merited punishment." Andrew Jackson was not anti-Indian. He had adopted a Creek orphan, Lincoya. Robert Remini wrote that Lincoya was given almost every advantage a planter's son enjoyed, including an education, and Jackson tried to get Lincoya admitted to West Point. Robert Remini wrote, quote, "It has been asserted that Andrew Jackson hated the Indians, and that racial annihilation was his real objective. Nothing could be further from the truth. Jackson neither hated Indians nor intended genocide. He killed Indians in battle, but had no particular appetite for it. He simply performed his duty. Jackson befriended many Indians. Dozens of chiefs visited him regularly at the Hermitage. He sanctioned marriages between whites and Indians. The Cherokee Nation is thriving today, the second largest in the U.S. So this is an article by Jarrett Stepman, March 2015. Keep Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill. Again, Jackson was in favor of moving all Indians west of the Mississippi River. Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi wanted to break Indian treaties and move them west. 1831, the Choctaw Indians from Mississippi were moved west. It was a tough trip in winter. French visitor Alex de Tocqueville wrote, quote, "It was then in the depths of winter, and that year the cold was exceptionally severe. The snow was hard on the ground, and huge masses of ice drifted on the river. The Indians brought their families with them. There were among them the wounded, the sick, newborn babies, and old men on the point of death. They had neither tents nor wagons, but only some provisions and weapons. I saw them embark to cross the great river, and the sight will never fade from my memory. Neither sob nor complaint rose from that silent assembly. Their afflictions were of long standing, and they felt them to be irredeemable." Jackson biographer H.W. Brands wrote, quote, "To preserve the Cherokees as a tribe, to enforce Chief Justice John Marshall's decision would have required raising and sending federal troops to Georgia, stationing them there indefinitely, and ordering them to shoot white Georgians who threatened the Indians. Jackson realized that American democracy simply wouldn't sustain such a policy." Now, the other ongoing major conflict, which led to the Civil War, was that of slavery and growing conflict between North and South. 1831, Nat Turner, who was a slave, led a slave rebellion in Virginia in which 57 European descent Americans were killed, mostly women and children. And this really scared white Southerners. New slave laws were passed, making it illegal to teach slaves to read. And then there was the censorship of abolitionist pamphlets. So this was connected to problems with South Carolina, which there was talk of secession in South Carolina. Was connected partly to slavery and also the tariff law, which was meant higher prices for imports from Europe, which affected the South more and protected northern manufacturing. Daniel Webster, who was a strong, generally an opponent of Andrew Jackson, on this issue he was supportive and supported the need for union and to stop secession of South Carolina. Daniel Webster said in 1830, quote, "God grant that in my day at least that curtain may not rise." He's talking about secession. "God grant that in my vision never may be opened what lies behind. When my eyes shall be turned to behold for the last time the sun in heaven, may I not see him shining on the broken and dishonored fragments of a once glorious union, on states dissevered and discordant, belligerent, on a land rent with civil feuds, or drenched, it may be, in fraternal blood. Let their last feeble and lingering glance rather behold the glorious ensign of the Republic, now known and honored throughout the earth, still full high advanced, its arms and trophies streaming in their original luster, not a stripe erased or polluted, not a single bar obscured, bearing for its motto no such miserable interrogatory as, 'What is this all worth?' nor those other words of delusion and folly, 'Liberty first,' and union afterwards, but everywhere, spread all over in characters of living light, blazing on all its ample folds as they float over the sea and over the land, and in every wind under the whole heavens, that other sentiment, dear to every true American heart, liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable." So this issue of conflict between the federal government and South Carolina was ongoing. In 1830, the Jefferson Day dinner, April 13th, in Washington City, growing conflict again over the tariff and slavery. And Andrew Jackson gave a toast. He said, quote, "Our federal union, it must be preserved." John C. Calhoun, his vice president, a southerner from South Carolina, gave a toast and said, "The Union, next to our liberty, most dear." Jackson biographer H.W. Brands wrote, quote, "Liberty was vital, to be sure, yet Jackson's half-century of struggle against the British, the Spanish, the Indians, and everyone else who threatened the safety and integrity of the United States had taught him one overriding lesson, that the Union was the only guarantor of American liberty, It was a cliche, but no less true for its triteness, that in union lay strength. April of 1830, Vice President John C. Calhoun supported the South Carolina nullification of the federal tariff. Nullification, which meant, they're going to say, we're not going to obey this law, which was really promoting illegality. So this is a real problem, conflict. So Jackson was in conflict with his vice president, John C. Calhoun, and Jackson said in 1830, quote, "I had a right to believe you were my friend, and until now never expected to have occasion to say to you, in the language of Julius Caesar, Et tu, Brute?" 1832, Jackson was reelected. His vice presidential candidate was Martin Van Buren. The Whig candidate was Henry Clay. Jackson received 219 electoral votes, Clay only 49. After the election, the South Carolina legislature voted to nullify federal tariff laws and were preparing to secede from the Union. So this was a real crisis in American history. Now, it was a defiance of the law, the possibility of secession, the destruction of the Union. Jackson at this time, 1832, was gaunt. He had white hair, a near constant cough, a bullet in his chest. He was 65 years old, 6'1", 140 pounds, and he said, quote, "By the God of heaven, I will uphold the laws." President Jackson sent troops and a warship to Charleston, South Carolina. Earlier he had said to the people of South Carolina, quote, "I call upon you in the language of truth and with the feelings of a father to retrace your steps." In his second inaugural address, President Jackson in 1833 said, quote, "I feel in the depths of my soul that it is the highest, most sacred, and most irreversible part of my obligation to preserve the union of these states, although it may cost me my life." Jackson continued to try to convince the people speaking directly to the people of South Carolina, quote, "Contemplate the condition of that country of which you still form an important part. Consider its government uniting in one bond of common interest and general protection so many different states, giving to all their inhabitants the proud title of American citizen, protecting their commerce, securing their literature and their arts, facilitating their intercommunication, defending their frontiers, and making their name respected in the remotest part of the earth. Consider the extent of its territory, its increasing and happy population, its advance in arts which render life agreeable, and the sciences which elevate the mind. See education spreading the lights of religion, morality, and general information into every cottage in this wide extent of our territories and states. Behold, it is the asylum where the wretched and the oppressed find a refuge and support. Look on this picture. Look on this picture of happiness and honor and say, we too are citizens of America. He continued to talk to the people of South Carolina. Quote, "The dictates of a high duty oblige me solemnly to announce that you cannot succeed." He's talking about their talk of secession. "The laws of the United States must be executed. I have no discretionary power on the subject. My duty is emphatically pronounced in the Constitution. Disunion by armed force is treason. Are you really ready to incur its guilt? On your unhappy state will inevitably fall all the evils of the conflict you force upon the government of your country." 1833, President Jackson passed the Force Bill, which meant the U.S. Army would be sent to South Carolina to enforce the federal laws on the tariff. And this conflict with John C. Calhoun continued, and South Carolina. President Jackson mobilized thousands of troops to fight South Carolina. He threatened to hang John C. Calhoun, the South Carolina secession leader. That same year, later, he was traveling in Boston. He went to Harvard. President Jackson received an honorary doctorate there. February 1 was the date that South Carolina announced it would cease collecting the federal tariff, so the crisis continued. Henry Clay was working to reduce the tariff to appease the South Carolina nullifiers. And President Jackson favored that, so they were hoping to come to a compromise. In March, there was the compromise tariff was passed along with the force bill, and the authorities in South Carolina backed off. The crisis was averted, and it was the use of the carrot and the stick, which was very effective. So thank goodness they were able to overcome that crisis, solve that crisis. In May of 1833, the 24-year-old Abraham Lincoln was given the job of postmaster in New Salem, Illinois. Well, that concludes today's presentation. We'll continue next time with Andrew Jackson, Part 4. Good luck to you finding a good history book to read. I hope you have a good one already or find a good one. And you might consider checking out our website, Adventures in History with Peter J. Ray at peterjray.com. We have made 560 history videos in 7 categories: world history, American history, book reviews, poetic tours, Cleveland baseball, family history, and autobiography. You also might consider checking out our podcast, Adventures in History, which is available, you can listen to on Spotify, Breaker, Google Podcasts, and Radio Public. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.